Bishop, ladies and gentlemen, you're all very welcome to our April lecture here in the Seven Oaks Hotel, part of our CHAS lectures during the year. And I'm delighted this evening to welcome Dr. Liz Dawson. She's a medieval historian with an expertise on the early medieval history of Ireland. She has lectured at University College Dublin, Queen's University Belfast, and most recently here in St. Patrick's College here in Carlow. She's been the recipient of numerous awards, including the NUI Grant for Early Career Academics and the IRC Postdoctoral Fellowship, and has worked with the Discovery Programme, the UCD Mícheál Cléirigh Institute, and the Royal Irish Academy. Her lecture this evening is on St. Brigid, forging an early medieval saint. So we very much look forward to the lecture, and Liz, you're most welcome.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much. Thanks so much for that lovely introduction. And I just want to say thank you as well to the committee and also to Paul, especially for the invite to come and speak with you today. So it's a real pleasure to be able to speak to you about Brigid this year, as it coincides with the 1500th anniversary of her death day, which is purported really to have happened either in 524 or 526. So we're really splitting the difference here today. And I think what's really wonderful about the celebrations, and also the fact that we now have a bank holiday to commemorate and celebrate Brigid, is the fact that there's a range of scholarly and also public events that have taken place. And this has really led to a wide range of discussions, and it's ignited some of the debates as well about Brigid the saint and also Brigid the person, who sometimes gets a bit lost in all of these discussions. So today what I want to do is I want to merge some of those discussions, both the public and the scholarly, in the short time that we have. And in particular, what I want to do is I want to focus on the earliest evidence for Brigid, and especially to highlight what could be said about her historicity and her role as well as a saint. And in doing this, I'm really hoping that it's going to bed down some of the most contentious elements of her persona, and offer really a greater perspective on, historical perspective really, on her importance. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to really initially give you or offer you some information on what's generally known about Brigid in the early medieval period specifically, and then on the surviving evidence that we have, the surviving documents that we rely on to tell us about her earliest cult, okay? And then what I'm going to do is move on to more specific elements of her saintly role. So this is kind of work that I'm looking at myself at the moment. So really what I want to do is I want to look at her role as a patron saint. And this is something that I think is really crucial in understanding the quite elevated position that Brigid occupies even in the 7th century, which is when we get our first written records emerging from Ireland. Okay, so who was Brigid? What do we know about her? So Brigid is one of the most significant and influential Irish saints of the early Christian period and beyond. She's particularly important as an Irish female saint whose cult spread across the island of Ireland and also to the continent. And indeed, the extent of her renown shouldn't be underestimated. It's Brigid, out of all of the medieval Irish saints, who has proved the most popular, and in the medieval period proved the most popular with continental audiences. And this is something that's borne out in the number of continental manuscripts that contain copies of her biographies. So for instance, if we compare, and it's terrible to compare her with Patrick all of the time, but we simply do, but if we compare her to Patrick, the lives of Brigid are preserved in a far greater number of manuscripts on the continent than, let's say, the lives of St. Patrick. Now, most fundamentally, Brigid is said to have been the founder and the abbess of the important dual monastery at Kildare. So it's a dual monastery where both male and female females live, okay, alongside each other. And the assertion that she is the founder of that monastery is something that is very likely to have, I think anyway, a basis in reality. And we certainly know that future custodians of that position yielded significant power as a result of holding that position. Now, perhaps most tellingly, Brigid is the subject of the first extant surviving extended narratives or biographies written about any Irish person. Okay, so that is such a feat in and of itself, and really points to the fact that she had a significant status, at this early point in the history, the Christian history of the island. Now, I suppose it might be expected that because of this extraordinary renown, the scholarship on Brigid and her early cult, would be quite exhaustive. But unfortunately, this isn't actually the case. So there are, of course, many very insightful studies on Brigid, but there are a number of recurring hurdles that dominate. Now, these include the suggestion that Brigid gained her status as a result of her association with a pagan goddess of the same name. Now, I'm not going to dwell too much on this. I'm happy to take questions on it later. But what I will say is that this is a modern assumption, and it's not one that medieval audiences would have necessarily made. Now, a further complicating factor in appreciating the communities that supported and moulded the Brigian cult is the traditional approach of Irish scholarship, which equates the power of saints, even those who realised, quite an island-wide following from a really early point. So I'm thinking of, let's say, Patrick and Brigid in particular. They tend to be equated with very specific monastic houses or federations. So we have Patrick equated with Armagh and the power of Armagh, Brigid associated with Kildare and the power of Kildare. And this really means that expressions of Brigidine veneration tend to be understood in relation to the aspirations of the monastery at Kildare. And this is something that I think is quite problematic. Because while some Brigidine writers really do fit within that tradition, others are less well defined, and they seem to be, have a wider allegiance or have alternative or different motivations in writing their lives or biographies of Brigid. Now, another complication that we have relates to dating. So we've got various different early sources, but the precise date of some of these sources is problematic. So for instance, there's a number of debates about which of the earliest biographies comes first, what's the priority, and this has really dominated scholarship. It's, luckily for you, it's not something I'm going to dwell on today. We don't need to talk about dating too much, but some of the comments that I might make might actually relate to dating. So just to let you know that that is something that we do see cropping up in the scholarship regularly. Okay, so what about the evidence that we have for Brigid? So we actually have a range of texts that mention Brigid in the very earliest source material that emerges from Ireland. Our earliest written sources date to the 7th century, and some of those earliest, in fact, the earliest datable ones, mention Brigid, okay? So the types of sources that we would see her mentioned in, they range greatly. So we have shorter texts, so for example, poems, hymns, all the way up to extended narratives and biographies. I've mentioned that Brigid is the first person that Irish writers wrote about, and her earliest biography is that written by a monk at Kildare, known as Cogitosis. So he probably was writing at Kildare in and around the 670s. Now there's a further anonymous life, an early life known as the Vita Prima, and this life survives. It's anonymous. We can't be entirely sure where it was actually written. It could have been written as early as the mid-7th century, but there's debates about this. So some scholars would suggest that it's earlier than Cogitosis's life. Other scholars suggest maybe it dates a little bit further into the early 8th century. Regardless, it has a lot of early material in it. And so those two lives I'm going to talk about today. Okay. Now, I've given you a few nice images here, just to show you how Brigid is appreciated even outside of Ireland. So this manuscript that you can see here, this is the calendar of Willibrord. It's a text that is suggested to have been written in Echternach, in modern-day Luxembourg. And you can maybe possibly see, and the very first line, this is a calendar, by the way, that commemorates saints. So it gives a calendar, a date of saints, okay? So on the very first line, we have the first martyr saint, Polycarp, is being celebrated. But you can see towards the end of the line, it mentions Brigid. Her name is the very last name at the top right. But you can see then also that the scribe has added in above the line to say it's the Virgin Brigid, okay? And that's an 8th century manuscript. Now, I want to really kind of just start by giving you some kind of an appreciation of the type of saint that Brigid is. So while lots of saints, they, I suppose, stick to a particular mold, we have certain expectations of our saints, okay, that they, kind of perform miracles and so on. Each saint has their own specific persona. And the persona of Brigid that builds up around her and that we see in these earliest writings is a very well-defined persona, okay? So to various different audiences, she was understood as all of these things and more. So a nun, a leader of her community at Kildare, a leader of her community, the Leinster community, and even an Irish community as well. She was understood as a virgin and a mother, much like the Virgin Mary, referred to as a mother because of her role as a leader and her role, her pastoral role amongst her community. And then we very much see her as a healer. So we get lots of different miracles about Brigid, where she is healing the sick, helping lepers, for example. We also see a real connection with animals as well. Not surprising, of course, because Ireland is an agrarian society and very heavily dependent on agriculture. This is actually a depiction from a Ruskin Ara's manuscript here, and here you can see her. She's depicted along a number of different female saints, but Brigid is very clearly identified because she has a calf, or I presume it's a calf, beside, an animal beside her. So I've just given you one example of one of the types of miracle tales that you get in these early lives that I've been talking about. This is just extremely typical. It's actually, this tale is found in both Cogitosis's Life of Brigid and also a very similar one in Vita Prima, because they share some similar material. Okay, so this is of the cooked bacon given to a dog and later found intact. So this is from Cogitosis's Light. So Cogitosis says, I feel I must not pass over unrecorded the famous miracles which were wrought by the most renowned handmaid of God, who was unceasingly dedicated to God's service. Once, as she was cooking bacon in a cauldron for some guests who had arrived, she was moved to compassion and gave it to a fawning, begging dog. And when the bacon was taken from the cauldron and later divided among the guests, it was found to be perfectly intact, as if none of it had been taken away. And those who witnessed this were full of admiration and with fitting praise spread the renown of the maiden, who in the quality of her faith and the merit of her good virtues was beyond compare. And if you go through the lives of Brigid, these are the types of miracles that you'll find. They're the types of miracles that would have resonated with Irish audiences, but they're also very much in that vein of imitatio Christi, okay, so following biblical stories and particularly tales relating to Jesus. Okay, so now that we've kind of got an impression of what Brigid was like as a saint and what these texts, the general outline of Brigid the Saint that they give us, what I now want to do is I want to move on to some aspects and a particular aspect of Brigid's saintly persona that we can look at through the lens of these early biographies. So in particular, I want to focus on one element of her sainthood, and this is her role as a patron saint. And the reason that I want to consider this is because it's something that really sets her apart and helps us in appreciating her significance and even her origins. So first of all, what I want to do is explain what a patron saint is. I suppose today we are very familiar with patron saints, all right? We all think of the likes of Patrick, he's a patron saint. We understand Brigid as a patron saint, Columba as well. But in the early medieval period, the period that I'm talking about today, church patrons are often associated and defined even by location and by jurisdiction. So for instance, really small regional areas, you tend not to get these big patron saints, okay? So patrons tend to be associated with places like Italian city-states would have a patron saint that represented them, and it's through them that their identity is expressed, so the two become quite intertwined. So in this instance, what would happen is the saint is a representative of those particular and usually small communities. And it's not really until the emergence of much larger politically stable nations from about the 12th century onwards that you get this idea of national patron saints. And this comes to the fore at that point. So I've given you a picture here of St. George. St. George becomes a patron saint of a whole range of different places. Obviously, England is the best example of that. And George came from Turkey, but he became particularly important from the time of the Crusades onwards. Okay, that's when people really start to associate him with places like England, and that is how he becomes the patron saint of England and, again, other regions as well, and because he resonates as part of that chivalric type of identity. Now, in an Irish context, we're used to acknowledging three patron saints, so Brigid, Patrick and Columba, as I mentioned. But what is very clear is that Columba is an addition to this lineup at a later date. Okay, so he doesn't actually become associated, even in the earliest life we have for Columba, which dates to about 700. Columba is not referred to as a patron saint. It's into the 8th century that the three of them really become associated. So I suppose the question remains as to why and when Brigid and Patrick were first afforded this really unique and expansive status. And I think it's really worth highlighting at this point that this is an extremely unusual status when viewed in relation to the cults of other saints in the early medieval period. Okay, so today what I want to do is look at this specific element within the lives that I've mentioned. Okay, and there's a couple of different reasons why I think this is useful. So in the first instance, the lives themselves share a considerable number of miracles. Okay, they have this similar understanding of Brigid. They understand her as having a nationwide status. But the place that Brigid occupies within these lives, as we'll see, is fundamentally different. So I want us to think, why might that actually be the case, and what does that tell us? In addition to this, the place and territory of any saint, they're really, really important indicators of the status of a saint. Because we usually appreciate saints in relation to their local dynamics, so Brigid being the patron of Kildare, or attached to that community, Patrick with Armagh, okay? Because we think of saints in that way, the fact that these saints achieved greater status and greater renown is worth some consideration. And I think it also, what it does is it gives us an insight into the communities who are forging these identities for these saints. Now, also crucially, the earliest references to Brigid, they suggest that she's a patron of the entire island. So from the very start of Brigid's cult, the beginning of those writings, as soon as they emerge, this status is already instituted. This is not something that needs to be created. It's not something that we see developing over time within the source material. It's something that's already there by the 7th century. And even within these sources, as I'm going to show you, she's seen operating outside of these traditional jurisdictional boundaries, which saints rarely do. So really, I think this is something that's going to be very useful in understanding the type of saint that Brigid is, and perhaps can also give us an early glimpse into the development, in Kildare and beyond Kildare, from the 5th century up until the 7th century, when we get our written documents as to what was happening there. I should also mention that her association with Mary, which is fundamental to Brigid's persona, it's something that no other female saint has. She's presented not just as being like Mary, but being another Mary. And I think that this is an association which again dates to the earliest point of these sources. We see Mary being mentioned in these early sources. This is something that again gives Brigid an even greater status and renown. So the earliest texts, the very, very earliest, are fragmentary lines written about Brigid. And I've given you both of them. What's interesting about these early references is that one of them actually comes from Armagh. It's a text known as the Liber Angli. Various different dates have been posited for this text, but this particular entry could have been written as early as 640, all right? So before any of our, quite extended narratives emerge. It could have been written maybe 20 years later, but still it's extremely early. It's coming from Armagh, which tells us as well that this is, it's outside of Kildare. It gives us an insight into other communities and what they think about Brigid. The second reference then you see here is a 7th century poem written about Brigid called Brigid Be Bitfa. And again, it mentions Brigid. And what I want you to you'll probably see it when we read through them, is the similarities between these two texts. So Liber Angli says that between Holy Patrick and Brigid, pillars or dignitaries of the Irish Church, there existed so great a friendship of charity that they were of one heart and of one mind. Brigid Be Bitfa then says, may she destroy within us the taxes of our flesh, the branch with blossoms, the mother of Jesus. She and Prime Patrick are the kingdom's two columns, very similar to the pillars that are mentioned in Liber Angli. They're the two columns, she the beautiful calyx, the regnal queen. And I think it's a very clear presentation of both patron saints here. Patrick is the father of the church, Brigid is the mother of the church. Okay, she's Mary of the Gael, she's mother of the church. But even though this may seem like such a straightforward expression of their status, what is important here is the fact that these are some of our earliest references to these two saints, and they are seen alongside each other, and they are presented as having a very unique and expansive status that doesn't just relate to Armagh and also doesn't just relate to Kildare. So this status is something that's thoroughly ingrained by the 7th century, and the best demonstration of this really comes from the earliest biographies that are produced on the island about Brigid. Okay, so the two top texts here, that by Cogitosus and then the anonymous Vita Prima that I mentioned. Okay, each of these texts presents Brigid as a saint of national renown, but they do so in different ways. So I want to begin really by looking at Cogitosus. This is just a random picture that I have here, but I couldn't help putting it in, by the way. So it is, it's a small fragmentary little piece of text that was found quite recently in the last number of years. It accompanied a small relic. The relic didn't exist, but a small reliquary. And what you can see here, again, found on the continent, found in France. But what you can see is it says that it's the relics of Brigid, the relics of Dubhthach, who's Brigid's successor, and those of Columba again. And it's been dated to in and around 700. So a very, again, early reference to Brigid on the continent, and accompanied by relics as well. So I'm going to begin with the discussion of Cogitosus in relation to this idea of, sainthood and patron sainthood. So the life by Cogitosus offers the greatest expression of the significance of the monastery at Kildare in the medieval period. It's well established that the author purposefully focuses his narrative in Leinster and more specifically in Kildare. Even though Kildare actually it's not mentioned in the text, there is absolutely no ambiguity in this text that Brigid is positioned at Kildare and that this is her home. Now, the Kildare cleric is a particularly organised writer. Okay, he offers a very clear narrative about Brigid's sainthood. And many scholars have pointed out that the work is structured using a framing device that begins and ends the life with descriptions of Kildare. So it connects the main body of miracle tales, all those miracle tales about animals and lepers and so on. It connects them with a starting point that references Kildare and an end point then that references Kildare. And indeed even the church itself, the physical church. So one of the things that Cogitosus does is at the end of his life, he positions the audience in Kildare and offers a number of posthumous miracles. So these are miracles that happen in Kildare after Brigid's death. So he relates a number of different stories, let's say, about building parts of the Kildare church. And he says to people, you can come and you can see this. So Brigid is still active at the site, even in the 7th century. Now, it might seem that because Brigid is positioned at Kildare solely, that this would, be at the expense of her nationwide status, but this is certainly not the case. Because what Cogitosus does is he uses the site and the saint's miracles, her various different miraculous workings, to demonstrate her standing and to claim an elevated position for her. So it might seem that while exclusively positioning Brigid there, that he localises her, but that's not actually the case. Instead, whilst grounding Brigid at Kildare, Cogitosus suggests that her influence is such that multitudes from across the island of Ireland really flock to her. And this is really something that's very evident from the beginning of the text, but also in the final sections of the text. And I know this is very difficult to read, and I apologise, but I will read it out for you. So this is the description that cogitosis gives to us. It's a very famous description. Every archaeologist in Ireland loves this description because it gives us an insight into what a church building in the 7th century would have looked like. So he says that Kildare is a church with its spacious settee, its awesome height, towering upwards. It's adorned with painted pictures, and inside there are 3 chapels, which are spacious and divided by board walls under the single roof of the cathedral church. The first of these, which is painted with pictures and covered with wall hangings, stretches widthwise to the east part of the church from one wall to another. Who can count the different crowds and the numberless people flocking from all of the provinces? Some for abundant feasting, others for the healing of their afflictions, others to watch the pageant of the crowds, others with great gifts and offerings to join in the solemn celebration of the feast of St. Brigid. So that's a nice description of what was happening on the 1st of February in Kildare in the 670s. But what also is happening here is that cogitosis is presenting a pretty simple scheme. The reader is consistently reminded of the centrality of Kildare and its connections to Brigid, but her status as that patron saint is still highlighted, because what we see people from across the island, from all of the provinces of Ireland, flocking to that one spot. Now, I'm going to move on to Vita Prima, but before I do, another nice image. Here is coming from a 16th century manuscript. So this is another book of ours. So you can see here up at the top, again, it's a list of predominantly female saints, but you can see Brigid the Virgin is mentioned up at the very top of that manuscript there. So Vita Prima, on the other hand, is quite a different life. Again, it contains many of the same miracle stories, all right? But it is, I suppose, developed entirely differently, okay? And the way in which it's structured is that it's set around a series of geographical circuits, which see the saint spend time in every single part of the island. So she goes to the north, she goes to Connacht, she goes to Munster, she goes to the territories of the Mícheál, who had taken over significant parts of Leinster at this point. And then finally she spends considerable amount of time in Leinster. Now, Brigid's travels around the island are foreshadowed in the initial episodes of the life, which sees her pregnant mother, Broicsech, who is a slave, and later the infant Brigid visit every single province of the island. So what we have is, we've got one circuit where she is travelling with her mother, either when she's pregnant or when she's a young infant. She then becomes a nun, and then we get another circuit, a larger circuit, where she travels as a nun, okay? Now, the connections that are made in that first mini circuit are strengthened by the fact that the individuals who are responsible for Brigid and also her mother claim association with all of these regions. So her father is of Leinster stock, and the poet who owns her, she then moves on to a poet unnamed, is connected with the Mícheál territory. We then have a druid who buys them, and that druid is associated with the north, with Connacht and with Munster. The second circuit then that takes place when Brigid becomes a nun eventually mirrors the same scheme, with Brigid accompanied by a retinue of patrician bishops. So in every single province, a different patrician bishop comes with her and travels with her. When she's in Leinster, she's fine. She's allowed to travel around Leinster freely. But as a woman, there's an expectation that she travels with a male cleric. And these are all patrician clerics that go with her. Now, whilst these travels are a clear and organising component of the work, Brigid's strong connection to Leinster is always maintained. This is really achieved through a series of kind of return journeys that are always made. So every time she goes to a province, she goes back to Leinster, and then she travels again, and then she goes back to Leinster. So we always know, yes, she's a Kildare saint. or a Leinster saint, but she's a saint for other provinces as well. Now, the focus on Leinster, rather than Kildare specifically, shows us really that the author of this life is probably an author who's not coming from Kildare. I think it's very likely that this is an author who's coming from outside of traditional Kildare boundaries, possibly from another monastery in the Leinster region. Now, so what Vita Prima does is it presents a very clear articulation of Brigid's nationwide status, unlike, of course, Cogitosus, who has to work to get all of the people to come to Brigid. Brigid is now going out to all of these different provinces. So this is an example from Vita Prima. This is when she goes to Munster when she's an infant. And you can see that the Munster men aren't particularly a fan of Brigid being there. But the tale goes that one day the infant's voice was heard. She was praying to God and stretching out her hands to heaven. A man greeted her and she replied, "This will be mine, this will be mine." The Druid, on hearing this, said, "The answer which the infant has given is a true prophecy, because this place will be hers forever." Which later proved true, for today St. Brigid has a large parochia parish in those regions. When the inhabitants of that area, so Connacht, heard this, they flocked to the Druid and they said to him, "You stay with us, but let the girl who is prophesying that our territories will be hers depart from us." The Druid replied, "The bondmaid and her daughter I'm not going to leave. Rather, what I'm going to do is turn my back on your country." Okay, so very clear articulation of the fact that if you don't convert, you're essentially in trouble. So why then is it, given all of the evidence that we have here today, that Brigid and her origins have been overshadowed? And I think that that is actually a good term to use for Brigid's biography and our understanding of Brigid as a historical saint and as a historical person. What I've shown you here today is that there's a huge range of material relating to Brigid in the earliest part of our written record. Okay, much like Patrick, we don't necessarily question Patrick's historicity, or indeed Columba's historicity, because we have some written documents relating to them. Brigid, however, I think is overshadowed for a range of different reasons. One of those main problems is her status, the fact that she is so important and her status is so unusual. We have a very problematic assumption, okay, that Brigid and Patrick and their associated churches, that they were rivals. And to some degree that is actually the case, but predominantly what we see within our written record is that there is an acknowledgement of the importance of these two saints across a range of different, written evidence from various different communities, which show us that both Brigid and Patrick were understood as being exceptionally important from an early date. Now, I mentioned the problem relating to the goddess and associations of Brigid with the goddess. This is something that we really see coming to the fore in the 19th century, particularly with the literary revival in Ireland. But it is not something that's part of that medieval cult. So what I'm suggesting is that when we look at Brigid, we consider why she may have achieved such a renowned status, even in the earliest texts that survive. And what I'm suggesting is that what makes most sense is that because she was the founder of a significant monastery on the island of Ireland, that this is why she, alongside Patrick, is presented as such a renowned and important saint for a whole range of communities on the island and beyond. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for a fascinating lecture. Liz, we'll have maybe a few questions, if that's okay with you. Can I just ask you maybe at the beginning, just to set the thing going, just and it probably is not a very sensible question to ask, really. But there are so many different spellings for Brigid. You chose to use Brigit. We would probably be more familiar with Brigid or Bridget, and maybe many others. Is there any significance in the different spellings?
It's really just got to do with the time at which something is written. So I use the IT spelling because I'm working from the Latin sources, and that is how it was spelled at the time.
Perfect.
Yeah.
A more sensible question than from the floor.
Everybody asks that question, by the way. So yeah, loads of people ask that.
Any questions? Yes?
Oh yes, yeah. The which? Oh yes, yeah. So there a lot of them are in France. That particular one, I can't remember. I think it is one of the Willibrord one. Yes, so it's in the National Bibliothèque in Paris. Yes.
Relics of St. Brigid.
Oh yeah.
Specifically the one in Portugal in
The skull.
Dubhthach.
Yeah.
Skull.
Well, yes, they're of a later. They're later. They don't date to this early period. So the references that we have to Brigid's relics, we get them in Cogitosis. He references the fact that both Brigid and Conleth, who is the bishop at Kildare in the 5th century, that their bodies are there. Okay, but then we get a range of different stories. There's more than one skull of Brigid, by the way, that's been found. It's not, but the Portugal one is the most famous one. Yeah, I mean, let's say John de Courcy in the 12th century, finds the relics of Patrick, Brigid and Columba miraculously. So we know at that point that the Brigid's bones are probably not at Kildare, or there isn't a tradition that they're there. It's perhaps being moved, but there certainly is. It's unclear exactly what's happening at Kildare and where those relics have gone to.
Yes. Yep.
So, the story where she was born.
Oh yeah. There's a load. That seems to be a real bone of contention about where she's actually born.
Especially when you say like that.
Yeah.
Like, is it just a good story to make up?
Yeah. There's loads of good stories. The reality is that these early texts don't give us any insight into where she's born. There's various different traditions around whether it's in Laois, whether it's outside of Monastravan, as you say, and a lot of that comes down to the fact that she's associated with this quite small kin group, but an important kin group known as the Faughart. And the Faughart were scattered across Ireland, but predominantly in Leinster. So a lot of the places where that group are associated with, then there's been traditions around her being born there. In terms of the early sources that we have a number of different stories. Cogitosa says that Brigid's parents were married and that they were Christian. So, which makes sense. He's a monk and that's what he wants. He wants a Christian Brigid, okay? Vita Prima, on the other hand, has this story about Broicsech, her mother, being a slave owned by Dubhthach, her father. And Dubhthach is married to the Queen. The Queen objects to Dubhthach having this daughter by a slave and sees it as problematic. So we get this story about Broicsech then being sold away from Dubhthach. He sells her because his queen, his wife, is being problematic, and he sells her on, and then you get these stories about her travelling around the island. So yeah, it's all up in the air.
Another question? Bishop?
Elizabeth, very good.
Yeah.
The Faughart clan, you call them.
Yeah.
Did they give the name then Faughart in Dundalk? Is that where we clearly associate Faughart?
Yeah.
I
Yes.
would always argue that the Faughart clan were more Kildare centric, not
Yes.
that high as County Louth.
Yeah, so they're scattered across. There's a great article by Thomas Charles Edwards where he looks at the various different constituencies of the Brigidine cult, and he has identified various different communities. There's even a Faughart community in Armagh.
Really?
Yeah, it's fascinating. They're definitely there. But yes, the Faughart give their name. And it's fascinating. They're such a small kin group, but they seem to derive their power from Brigid.
Any other questions?